Zoe has allowed me the unusual privilege of occupying the kitchen all by myself without adult supervision, and I'm going to take advantage of that by teaching you how to make what I call an oyster pie. Now, I must say, I feel Zoe's omnipresence nevertheless with me, and I'm going to be very careful to follow her instructions, to measure everything carefully and clean up as I go and so forth. I also feel my mother's presence because my mother calls this dish scalloped oysters, a more elegant term. I call it the more basic and earthy term of oyster pie. So when we go to Columbia at Thanksgiving and Christmas every year and we prepare this dish for our holiday meal, we call it scalloped oysters. I would advise you to call it oyster pie unless you are east of the inland waterway and anywhere near my 92-year-old mother, and then you'd probably be better off to call it scalloped oysters. This way we start. We start with a measured quantity of saltine crackers called a sleeve of saltines. Now, as everybody knows, saltines are a staple of life, and the modern practice of enclosing them in this container, which I call a sleeve, and most people call a sleeve, is really one of the few modern developments in cooking that's worthwhile, because not only does it measure out the quantity you need, it gives you the vehicle for crushing the saltines and making saltine crumbs. And the way you do that is simply by taking a rolling pin, an old-fashioned rolling pin, and whacking on those saltines until you reduce them to crumbles. Then you can finish it off with your hands, and it doesn't take very long as opposed to the old way, and you end up with just what you need, and that is somewhat of a mess, but saltine crumbs. Then you dump those into a pan in which you have previously melted butter and mix it all together and produce those extra rich saltine crackers that you need to complement the exquisite little oysters, the most delicate morsels consumable in life, that mollusk that has brought inspiration to people for generations. Now, having crushed up the saltines and the melted butter, we use a standard casserole pan, and we put a few saltines on the bottom of the pan to make a sort of a thin first layer, and then add those wonderful oysters to it. Now, you will notice that I handle an oyster as it should be handled, and that is with a substantial amount of reverence. I have great respect for the little mollusk. An oyster, of course, lives a solitary life, a life of non-mobility, is able to make any progress only when churned up by the tides of which he has no control. In that regard, an oyster is a lot like a judge, which is what I used to be. I'm now adding some sliced up mushrooms as a sort of a third layer, and then when I finish doing that, I'm going to cover all of it with a generous quantity of carefully measured salt and pepper. You need more salt for oysters than you would think you need. Next comes another layer of the saltine crackers, just leaving a few for the top, and then some more of the little oysters. As I say, an oyster is a lot like a judge, lives a solitary life, isn't really not allowed any forward momentum of his own or her own. But let me tell you something. There's a great power in solitude. Little tiny animal here no bigger than your thumb, and it takes a strong man and two hands and a sharp blade just to open up his door. And that's a tribute to the power of living alone, I think. And there's a lesson to be learned in that when you're dealing with such a person, particularly if that person happens to have the title of judge. Now some more of the crackers, obviously, the rest of the sleeve of crackers, even those that may have unfortunately fallen out on the table, no one will ever know sure none of you will ever tell who are watching this program. Now, a little more salt and pepper. Now, what I'm about to do next is the only real creative aspect of this dish, and that is making up a concoction here which consists of oyster juice, half oyster juice, and another half portion of milk, a squirt of carefully measured sherry, and another squirt of the Worcestershire sauce. We'll stir all that up and add it to our oyster pie. Now, how much are we going to add? We're going to add an amount that results in puddles being formed in the pie. That's how we can tell when we got enough. Puddles being formed in the pie. See the first puddle? We know we got enough. And there's the first puddle, and it's ready to go into the 350-degree oven. Now, by the miracle of television communication, we are now ready to produce instantly, which would normally take almost an hour, and that is a finished oyster pie. And here it is. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful? You can serve it right on the table, maybe add a little garnish of parsley, cut up thusly, so you never need a food processor. And as the French say, voila.